To make sure we get the full hour with Dr. Sunita Sah. I am so pleased to welcome you to our Research Ethics Grand Rounds here at the University of Colorado. Dr. Sah, for those of you who are not aware of her really interesting background, is an award-winning professor and an organizational psychologist. She's spent over a decade now conducting really very influential research on concepts that are very important in medicine and in medical research around advisor-advisee relationships and trust and conflicts of interest, the roles of disclosure and compliance. She's done some very fascinating and very influential work on concepts that are very important in medicine, like professionalism and the roles of our self-perceptions and our self-identities in the way that we manage conflicts of interest and our relationships with each other and with our patients and with research subjects and so on. Her research has been published in all the top academic journals, not only in medicine, but also in management and economics and psychology. She's also widely published in popular press like the New York Times and the Harvard Business Review and Scientific American. And Malia is going to put her full bio sketch into the chat for those of you who want to read even more. In the meantime, welcome, Sunita, and I understand you brought some slides to kick off the conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I will just put my slides up.
Got him.
Looks good.
So in today's presentation, I'm going to give you some insights from my body of research on conflicts of interest, and I will focus on some of the psychological processes involved when dealing with such conflicts. So I'm a physician turned organizational psychologist, and so I conduct my research from that angle. And I do believe our reactions to conflicts of interest and the policies intended to mitigate them cannot be fully understood without a thorough consideration of our psychological experience of them. So first of all, I had no funding for this presentation and no commercial funding from industry. So a number of policy solutions for dealing with conflicts of interest have been proposed, and I've written about these in detail in the paper that's cited here, and concluded that these solutions, ranging from fines and sanctions, education, second opinions to disclosure, unfortunately are largely based on inaccurate intuitions regarding the psychological processes that underlie them. So these policies tend to fail, or they could even have unintended consequences. And today I'm going to focus on just two of these, two potential solutions to conflicts of interest. So disclosing conflicts of interest and cultivating professionalism. So let's start with a disclosure that I've studied extensively to look at some of the psychological effects on both recipients, patients, advisees, as well as those that actually disclose them. And I want to look at where it hurts, could backfire, and also where it could possibly help. So we know disclosure is very popular. And why is that? Well, its great promise is that it arms recipients with potentially useful information. So it decreases that information gap between the advisor and the advisee so that advisees can make an informed choice. And what information do they get? Perhaps they get alerted to some uncertainty as to the quality of advice if your advisor has a conflict of interest. So what could they do? They could perhaps discount the advice, or they could shift to an unconflicted advisor. And why do we love this? Well, it really appeals to principles of transparency and free markets. And in some terms, it's quite simple compared to other major structural reforms and not too costly. So for many reasons, it's perceived to work, The question that I've asked over the years is, but does it? Does it work? And I'm going to challenge whether it's actually an effective fix. So I've conducted over 50 studies with over 15,000 participants in different contexts, and I've uncovered a series of unintended consequences, and I'm just going to highlight 2 of them today. So the first one, imagine you go see your doctor, and after talking to you, after examining you, perhaps you're still on the examination table like we see here, the doctor discloses, under disclosure rules, I'm required to tell you that I own stock in the company whose drug I'm prescribing. What do you do with that information? How do you react? What do you say to your doctor? And also imagine that your doctor recommends perhaps that you enter a clinical trial, but discloses the receipt of a referral fee if you enter the trial. Again, what do you say? How do you respond? I propose that we're likely to feel quite uncomfortable in these situations about signaling any kind of distrust or insinuating that the doctor could be biased in any way. So just imagine prior to the disclosure, perhaps there could be a range of reasons for rejecting the advice, the clinical trial. Maybe it's too risky, it's too painful, you don't like those particular side effects, you'd rather stick with a drug that you know you're going to get, that you've had before. But now that the disclosure is salient, it's more likely to be interpreted that it is because of the disclosure that you are saying no, and this signals distrust. You don't want to insinuate or let your doctor know that you don't trust them. And this psychological process, which I call insinuation anxiety, it's the fear or concern or apprehension of insinuating that the other person, your own physician, cannot be trusted, contributes to what I also call the burden of disclosure effect. And that is, with disclosure, the patient will trust the advice less. Perhaps that's the intended purpose. It's supposed to be a warning, so maybe that's what we want. But at the same time, with disclosure, the patient will feel increased pressure to act in favor of the doctor's disclosed interest. They'll feel this pressure to comply because they don't want to signal distrust or insinuate that the doctor is biased in any way. And these 2 hypotheses actually work in opposing directions as to whether the patient will take the advice or not. And whatever force is greater, the decreased trust or the increased insinuation and anxiety, determines whether they take the advice or not. So disclosure actually puts the patient or the consumer into an effective bind in that they want to discount information, but they also feel increased pressure to comply. So they end up being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So instead of being the warning that it is supposed to be, disclosure can actually become a burden on those it was supposed to protect, increasing the pressure to comply with their doctor's recommendation. Now, I found evidence for this increased pressure to comply when disclosure is present in numerous experiments that I've run in both the medical context and other contexts. And sometimes this pressure to comply is so great, it leads to more compliance with advice that comes with disclosure than without, even when the advisees are reporting decreased trust. So disclosure is popular. And if the intended effect of disclosure is to decrease trust, we do see that in our studies. But if this decreased trust happens within a relationship and it leads to insinuation anxiety, where the disclosure has now created these dynamics where it becomes much more uncomfortable to turn down the recommendation. So disclosure ends up having this serious unintended consequences in that it significantly increases the pressure to comply with the conflicted advice. So that's the first unintended consequence. The second one is, can disclosure actually ever increase trust? In a separate series of experiments, I found that the answer was yes, it can. And it happens in very information-rich environments where somebody is under a high cognitive load, or there's competing information, or they're making a difficult decision. For example, a medical decision, or maybe all the decisions that we make. And the effect is driven by inferences of expertise. So when we look at trustworthiness perceptions along 3 dimensions, expertise or ability or competence, or integrity, which is the honesty, and benevolence, it's the expertise that actually drives the effect. And it happens because people are not thinking about the disclosure or deliberating on it. They're thinking about the actual decision that they have to make. So for example, we've seen this in patients being told, given a diagnosis of cancer, and surgeons disclosing their bias. And in these situations, people are thinking about what treatment they will take. They're thinking about their lives. They're not thinking about the disclosure. And so what happens is that they process it automatically or peripherally, what some people call system 1 processing. It's unconscious, it's fast. They're making these associations that the disclosure is associated with expertise. Whereas in the first set of studies where we found decreased trust, it was easy to deliberate, or easier to deliberate on the disclosure and take that into account, and that decreases trust. So the way that you process the disclosures really accounts for the difference. So this is the unintended consequence number 2, that disclosures can increase trust when they're processed automatically. It's driven by expertise. And if you deliberate on the disclosure, it can mitigate the effect. Now, in our experiments, we actually had to be very hard hitting with the deliberation. So we eventually had to ask people, sit down and write out and think about what the conflict of interest actually means. In those situations, we did find a decrease in the trust. It mitigated it, but didn't go below non-disclosure. So it didn't reverse it as much as what we found in the first set of experiments. So in information-rich environments, it's actually quite hard to get the decreased trust effect. So that's disclosures expertise cue when disclosures are processed automatically. So now we've seen that there's 2 unintended consequences so far. One is decreased trust and one is increased trust, but both lead to increased compliance with the advice, which is arguably not what we wanted with disclosure, right? We wanted it as a warning, perhaps, and we're not seeing that. So these unintended consequences are particularly serious. So what can we do to improve disclosure? So for the first one, which the increased pressure to comply, you want to decrease the social pressure. So giving disclosures externally by third parties, letting people make decisions in private or having cooling off periods does indeed decrease the social pressure. So we've tested this empirically in a number of studies that they receive the information, they do report decreased trust, but this increased pressure to comply is decreased if you can make decisions in private, have cooling off period, or somebody else gives it to you. It's not directly from your own advisor. For the second unintended consequence, we want to increase deliberation as much as we can. So giving disclosures before the advice, much in advance, so you have time to deliberate, making sure that the disclosure is really salient, that people understand it, and they're deliberating is really important. So we wanted to test this. If we could remove the unintended consequences, how would disclosure actually work? So we went to Cleveland Clinic to run a very large field study here. We wanted to take advantage of a new policy that was being introduced at Cleveland Clinic, where physicians who had financial relationships with industry of $20,000 or more in the last year were required to disclose their conflicts of interest to patients. So we asked, can we actually test this and see what's going on once they disclose that? So we made some disclosure materials, so disclosing the conflict of interest in a written format. We piloted that with some patients, made sure that they understood it, tweaked it. We pre-registered a clinical trial. We were very highly powered, much over 80% to detect even a small difference in trust. And we had a sample of over 1,900 patients at 2 different outpatient clinics. And our intervention was a single mailed disclosure letter that went with the appointment letter, and the control group just received the appointment letter. So we provided the time for deliberation. It was a way, it wasn't directly from the advisor, to decrease the social pressures. So what did we find? So decreased trust is one possibility. Increased trust is another. So what do you think? What do you think we found? If you want to take a bet on those two things, who thinks decreased trust? Perhaps we can raise a hand in reactions for decreased trust. What about increased trust? Anyone? A few more? So what did we actually find? We actually found no effect at all. It was non-significant, and it was a null effect in a very highly powered experiment. So it seemed like a true null effect. We did see effects for patients' knowledge. So that was a very large effect size, going up to over 50%. So the knowledge was getting across. So it did reach patients. So that's good, even though it didn't reach everyone. It did reach many patients, but it had no effect in trust. It also had no effect on attending the appointment with the physician. So it's not that they were missing at their appointment, cancelling the appointment, switching to someone else. They had the same level of missing and cancelling appointments that's normally seen in Cleveland Clinic. But if we looked at the post-consultation survey, that's where we got our answers, is that 2/3 of patients, when they were asked, were the disclosures important to the decisions you made about your medical care, they were saying, no, it's not important at all. They were saying that it did not affect their opinion of their physician, which was really surprising to us, because a national survey had shown that if you're talking about a hypothetical physician, patients will say it's really important that their physician does not have conflicts of interest. It would affect their judgment. They would like to switch to a non-conflicted physician. But when it becomes about their own physician, this is what we see. 90% of the patients had little or no worry about their own physician's conflict of interest. And we call this process motivated reasoning, to think that one's own physician might not be affected, whereas other physicians might be affected. A little like when physicians say that they won't be affected by conflicts of interest, but others will be. So if we could remove the unintended consequences, perhaps disclosure was harmless here. But did it really solve the problem of conflicts of interest, and does it have any intrinsic value? I'm going to hold those questions and look at disclosure in another way, because this is when things also get very interesting. So rather than looking at the effects of disclosure on recipients and trying to have disclosure work there, does it affect the behavior of those that disclose? Now, disclosure could be attractive to physicians or researchers or advisors, because nothing really needs to change. You can carry on doing what you're doing and simply disclose. And it relieves advisors of any feelings of guilt for any unfavorable outcomes that might occur. And it could also limit professional liability. But in my research, I also found that it changes behavior in a couple of other ways, and it could be something positive. So disclosure can actually motivate advisors to reject conflicts of interest so they can disclose the absence of any conflicts. So we might want to start thinking about the effectiveness of disclosure resting less on recipients responding effectively and more about its influence over those whom the disclosure is about. And it's the fear of reputation damage or the motivation to appear unbiased that drives this behavior. And we've seen this in the field with successful initiatives like grading conflict of interest policies in academic medical centers. So those grading systems motivated institutions with low scores to enhance their policies in following years. You can also see it with health rating grades in restaurants. It's a self-calibrating aspect that if you can improve to get the A grade or the 5 stars, then you become motivated to do so. But the effectiveness of this depends on a couple of different factors. So first of all, the disclosures must be really simple and easy to interpret, such as a 5-star rating or a grade. Second, you must know that that disclosure is going out to people that are going to judge you on that, and that you are required to disclose it at the same time as you're accepting it. So you can make the choice. And quite often there's a temporal gap between accepting a conflict of interest and disclosing it. And there's certain conflicts of interest that are unavoidable. So what happens in these situations? So older research has suggested that disclosure might increase bias in advisors. But in several studies I've conducted more recently, I find that this story is not actually quite complete. So the prior research that found these effects were conducted in a student lab with non-expert participants, and it doesn't quite generalize to the field when we look at the actual behavior of physicians and other professionals. And it's really important for policy to know when this result holds and when it generalizes or you get a different results in other contexts. So in studies I conducted with actual professionals, so physicians, their professional norm, that's what physicians will say, and that's what lay people will say, is to put the patient first, because there's a strong professional norm here. What about financial advisors? Now, often for lay people, our stereotypes is that they put self-interest first or they're profit maximizing. But when you ask a certain subset of financial advisors, there are some that have a very strong fiduciary duty to put clients first. And way back in 2016, then President Obama signed an executive order that required financial advisors to put clients first. That was quickly overturned with the new administration. So we don't know whether that would have made a difference, but we can go to real professionals and really look at what disclosure is doing to their behavior. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is, what does disclosure actually signal to advisors? What do they think about it? And what I find is that it becomes a reminder of the professional norms. So, for example, we can just say that there's a context, maybe it's a financial context. There is some context where self-interest first norms are pretty strong, or maximizing profits become very strong. In these situations, we do indeed see an increase in bias with conflict of interest disclosure. But in other contexts where the norm is to put patients first, and that is a strong norm in the environment, we see a decrease in bias. And when you see such a sign reversal in research, it's really often due to context effects. So we need to think about what's happening in these contexts that are so different. So professional norms, what are they? They're shared belief systems, and the information from norms comes from multiple areas. So reference networks, peers, and leaders, institutional signals, the policies and rules at your institution, the incentives that are in place, the structures, legal signals, whether it's against the law or not, of course, training and experience, how you're socialized into a particular profession. And for lay people, it's also the mass media. If there are a lot of scandals, your norms and perceptions about those professions also change. And what I found in a series of studies is that if conflict of interest disclosure is simply a reminder of the professional norms, what if we just tell the advisors or remind them of their conflicts of interest rather than asking them to disclose? And I find that pretty much the same results, that just reminding advisors that they have a conflict of interest saw the same decrease or increase in bias, depending on the norm, as disclosing their conflict of interest. So what does this tell us? That disclosure can improve the quality of advice, but only if the norm in the environment is to place clients first. It acts as a reminder to do the right thing. So these professional norms are pretty powerful. If it is not acceptable to give self-interested advice, then conflict of interest disclosure will improve the quality of advice. So to summarize the professional norm research is that disclosure can have unintended effects on advisors if there is a self-interest first norm, but it also could be a signal that reminds them to place patients first, clients first, and rein in the bias in their advice. So it's not just about transparency and disclosure, it's also about the professional norms. So finally, on disclosure, I do want to warn that one of our biggest psychological processes to overcome with disclosure is our amazing ability to rationalize. And we can think that once we've disclosed that we've dealt with our moral obligations with respect to conflicts of interest. And this rationalization can crowd out even more effective solutions for managing conflicts of interest. So there could even be an indirect harm of disclosure if we implement it and don't think longer and stronger about what else we could do about managing conflicts of interest. And although the past few experiments that I've run show that disclosure can have this positive effect by decreasing bias when the norms are to place patients first or clients first, the effect size is much smaller than simply rejecting the conflict of interest. So it's not a great solution unless it leads people to completely reject the conflict of interest and improve the quality with that self-calibrating aspect. So we can conclude that disclosure is insufficient. It does not manage the conflict of interest, but merely identifies the existence of such conflicts. So we can then consider how to manage it. So what else could we do? So I already identified that professional norms might be useful. So let's examine that a little bit more. If they're very important, what do we actually mean by professionalism? So originally, professionalism was conceived of as a feature of traditional professions, such as medicine and law, that were organized like guilds, with codified training and high barriers to entry. But this concept of professionalism has now evolved into this general concept describing how one conducts oneself. So in the words of one pair of scholars, professionalism is a set of values and identities that can be mobilized by employers as a form of self-discipline. And many scholars state that a belief in self-regulation is a key aspect of professionalism, and the ability to actively manage the conflict between the client and personal interests to favor the client. So being able to manage those conflicts of interest. So if this professionalism is now a self-concept, can such a self-concept lead us to reject conflicts of interest, and can we cultivate professionalism? Now, it's really important because of how we think about ourselves. We often think that we are immune to unwanted influence. So physicians will say that they are not influenced by industry incentives, although they admit that other physicians might be influenced. And as this quote shows, I would not let an industry representative influence me to do anything that would not be in the best interests of my patients. I can manage my own brain. So this self-serving justification leads to a lack of ability to predict influence. That's why we see physicians and other professionals taking great offense at the notion that they might possibly be influenced by financial incentives. They claim to be a professional, and because of that, because of their professionalism, because of their high sense of integrity, they will not be influenced. But that reaction reveals the wrong mental model of conflicts of interest, that influence is within our conscious control. And although a strong sense of professionalism might help defend against intentional corruption, deliberate corruption, it does not mitigate from unintentional or implicit bias arising from conflicts of interest. So how might a sense of professionalism affect physicians? Well, a high self-concept, I've found, often coexists with a shallow notion of the concept of professionalism. And so paradoxically, it can lead to detrimental outcomes such as greater unethical behavior and increased vulnerability to conflicts of interest. And so it can make matters worse. So the more professional people feel they are, the more likely they are to accept conflicts of interest and be biased by them. So how does professionalism do that? Well, first of all, those with a strong but shallow sense of professionalism may more readily accept conflicts of interest because of their high confidence in their ability to consciously control for any biasing influence. So we've seen this in the domain of overeating and smoking, that if we have a strong belief in self-regulation, we won't remove the high-calorie foods from our house or a cigarette packet from our pocket. So we're more likely to lapse and then eat more and smoke more than we want to. And in the same way, those with a high sense of professionalism could be more willing to accept conflicts of interest precisely because they feel that they won't be influenced by them. And second, once a conflict of interest has been accepted, a high sense of professionalism may reassure someone that they're capable of warding off influence, and so they actually work less hard to correct for potential bias, which ironically can lead to greater acceptance of conflicts of interest and bias. And a number of cognitive psychological studies have confirmed this. So there could be a double harm that can arise from professionalism, in that it makes people more vulnerable to view conflicts of interest as acceptable and succumb to bias from those conflicts of interest. And alarmingly, these professionals remain unaware of the bias, so they can't predict it in advance and they can't recognize it in hindsight. So they can't learn from their failures. So what's needed is what I call deep professionalism rather than shallow professionalism. So shallow professionals fail to understand the risks of undue influence, and they rely on their own subjective feelings of professionalism, self-regulation, integrity, which can be wholly inaccurate. Whereas deep professionals, however, they recognize the risks and they avoid exposing themselves to conflicts of interest in the first place. So they embrace continued ethical training to help embed principles, and they display their deep professionalism with repeated ethical behaviors. So for example, if a hospital policy bans pharmaceutical reps from interacting with physicians in the hospitals and they stop the free lunches, physicians who understand the deeper concept of professionalism, they're going to also reject walking across the street from the hospital to the hotel conference room, where now the pharmaceutical reps have set up the free lunches. So even if the policy doesn't extend to perhaps physicians' behavior outside of the hospital, those with deep professionalism will understand and internalize the principles and values of self-regulation, and they'll also nurture the values repeatedly with an active practice. So they'll continue to reject those conflicts of interest. So what does this mean for policy? Now, I recommend that we integrate both clear policies and procedures to eliminate or at least mitigate conflicts of interest at the same time as we cultivate deep professionalism. So the best policy is to ban or reject conflicts of interest and make structural reforms so we can align incentives with patients' interests. And when that's not possible, another possibility is to implement separation and blinding policies. So, for example, institutions could allow the receipt of funding, provided that researchers are separated from decisions involving the funding source, they're blind to their identities, they never meet the people involved. And the blinding and separation needs to be implemented before specific situations arise to avoid distortions. So when I was presenting some of this research at another conference, I did have an orthopedic surgeon approach me at the end to say they did have a centralized fund in his institution, and he applied for some funding. He received that funding, but once he received it, he was required to write a thank you letter to the donor. And that, of course, degrades the independence, and it's no longer blind. So we need to make sure it's carefully implemented, and so people are shielded all throughout. I also believe we need to teach the concept and practice of deep professionalism at medical schools and in medical organizations with continuing medical education, and select positive role models into institutions who can display deep professionalism and change the cultural norms, the professional norms. So we could hire physicians and researchers who are high in intellectual humility, who understand the limits of their own ability to regulate bias and repeatedly reject conflicts of interest. So integrating the two approaches together, I believe, is the best approach to managing conflicts of interest. So here are my publications are available on my website if you want to delve into more detail on those, and please feel free to reach out, and I look forward to discussing.
Thank you so much, Sunita. I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to ask a couple questions to get us started, but I'm dying actually to go back to the very first thing you said, which is I'm a physician turned organizational psychologist, and I have so many questions about the substance of your talk, but I would love to hear. So, how did you move from being a physician to this line of work that you're in now? What was the path?
So it was a very carefully planned path, of course.
As so many careers are, yes.
So in the UK, the medical degree is a combined undergraduate and graduate degree. So I started off at medical school, and we get the opportunity to do an intercalated degree. And I did an intercalated degree in psychology. And what that means is in my third year of medical school, I was placed with a fourth year psychologists and basically tried to learn 4 years of psychology in 1 year. And I loved that aspect. But then I went back to medical school, I finished, and I started training. But I was really fascinated with psychology and influence still. So I remember there was one morning, we were on a ward round, I was with a senior physician, and we went past this cart in the corridor, and he stopped, and instead of picking up, there was some gifts left from a pharmaceutical rep, a whole pile of stationery. And instead of just picking up one or two, sort of a pen and a pad, he dived in with both hands and stuffed every pocket of his white coat. And then seeing the look of astonishment on my face, he said to me, we don't get the company cars. We don't get the annual bonuses like our non-medical friends. So these are the only perks of the job. So I became really fascinated with that. And it actually ended up being one of the first papers that I published, was to look at this sense of entitlement to industry gifts because we felt deprived. I did want to call that paper Because I'm Worth It, but JAMA wouldn't let me. And that got me really fascinated. And then I actually had the opportunity to do some consulting work for the pharmaceutical industry. And during that time, I really began to understand how much physicians were being influenced. So even though there was this sense of entitlement, I also recall we had this sense of invulnerability that we're really smart. We can control ourselves. I always ask the reps, more questions, and we just thought we were capable of warding off influence. But when I was doing some work for the pharmaceutical industry, I became aware that every interaction was a very sophisticated calculation for them on the return on investment, and they would calculate that what message, how many times, which doctors would create X amount of uplift in prescriptions. So I became fascinated with that, and I wanted to explore some professional dilemmas and conflicts of interest in more depth. So when I spoke to some professors in the UK, they were like, if you really want to study conflicts of interest, you should go to the US. So I came across, and it wasn't just because there was so much material in the US, there was some fantastic people already doing work on conflicts of interest. So I had really fantastic training and could delve into these questions that had fascinated me for years.
Really interesting. Can we talk a little bit about some of the things that people say? Because I think you touched on a couple of these, but the small gifts thing has always fascinated me. The idea that people say, well, of course I would avoid, a $10,000, cash payment. That would be a quid pro quo attempt, and I would reject that. But a piece of pizza, how can that possibly, that can't possibly influence my way of thinking or overcome my sense of professionalism. What do you say to that?
So, this is a common rationalization, and we see it in physicians. I've also seen it in other professionals. I've looked at managers across a range of different industries, and they will say the same thing, that they can manage their own brain and small gifts don't affect them. And there's now a solid body of evidence that shows that even small gifts, even the pizza lunch, does affect them psychologically. And there could even be a danger, I write about that in one of my papers, that the small gifts could be even more detrimental because it often goes below our radar of thinking that we could be affected. And so we're more likely to to accept them and more likely to be influenced by them. Whereas with large gifts, we know it comes with some scrutiny. So we might take some extra care in those situations. But it really depends on sort of accountability and scrutiny as well.
So, and the other one I hear is, well, I take a little gift from everyone. So
Yeah.
no one has any particular influence. I don't even remember which drug maker makes which drug. I'm sort of equally conflicted about all manufacturers. How do you think about that?
Yes, I have heard that one as well. You know, I speak to them all, but you are likely to make relationships with some more than others. Also, you're thinking more about sort of industry solutions to problems than non-industry solutions to problems. So that becomes a systematic bias within itself. So you might think about sort of, you know, instead of diet, exercise, and other aspects, you might immediately think about sort of industry solutions, treatments, drugs, all those things.
Yeah. There's a sentence in one of your papers that really jumped out at me because it relates, I think, to how we think about training people. It's back to the norms, right? And I think there are many folks who try to inculcate a sort of professional identity, which is, as you suggested, one that values putting the patient first, that says you should be objective, you should be unbiased. And so we try to teach people to think of themselves that way. And then I came across this sentence, which I'm going to just read the quote. People who are led to believe that they are unbiased, fair, and objective are more likely to behave in biased ways. So that was disconcerting because we try to get people to behave well by saying that is who you are. Are we thinking about professional identity formation all wrong?
And so that's a danger, right? Is that there is quite a bit of research that shows that there's the paradox of meritocracy, where organizations that really advocate for a merit-based system have actually been shown to be more biased against, for example, women when it comes to performance evaluations and career advancements. And so if we do think of ourselves as very objective and fair, what the research is showing is that we're so convinced that our perceptions are reality that we don't take into account other points of views, and it could lead indeed to us being more biased. So I think this really stresses the importance of having some intellectual humility. And that's not to say that self-efficacy is not important in medicine. It is very important, for example, for skill development. So in medicine, there is this, you know, see one, do one, teach one aspect of medicine, and it helps us gain confidence to go out there and do that and get skill development, have decisive decisions. But we're getting feedback there in the same way that if you lapse in smoking, it becomes very apparent that you've lapsed in smoking. The danger with conflicts of interest is that we're not aware of the bias that comes from it. We can't see it. And so we don't get any feedback on that. So it's completely unseen. And so we can't learn. And in that domain, we can become very overconfident in our ability to manage them. So what we need is not just education, we need to go beyond that, is just to change how we think about ourselves and have some intellectual humility to actually say, I don't know how much I've been influenced here. And, you know, it's likely I will be influenced. And so I am going to reject all gifts. So rather than being overconfident that our professionalism will protect us, we need to think, actually, in this situation, I need some self-doubt as to whether I can manage conflicts of interest or not.
Yeah, I wonder if you would say a word. I'm going to jump to an area that is parallel or adjacent to conflicts of interest, which is the intentional use of incentives to try and mold physicians' behaviors or other people's behaviors for that matter. But the intentional use of incentives, monetary incentives, to mold behaviors. And there's been a good deal of consternation within the medical profession, as I know you know, about pay for performance and the ways in which the crowding out phenomenon that you talked about in your slides might impair or hinder the otherwise beneficial sort of intrinsic motivation that leads people to want to get better and do better, because now they're being paid a quarter every time they are better or do better, right? How do you think about the concept of intrinsic motivation and the influence of extrinsic factors on intrinsic motivation?
So I think with intrinsic motivation, again, it's something that's difficult to, and every time we talk about a subjective feeling, we don't know how accurate we are in that feeling.
Yeah.
And so I think in those situations where there's such a weak correlation, when we look at those things like, how well do you think you do? How well do you think you're motivated to these things? There's a very weak correlation. And so, especially when we're poor performers, that, we end up thinking that, not only do we lack a skill, but we lack the ability to recognize that skill, right? So it's difficult to put too much weight on subjective feelings. I agree that there's some incentive structures that are also detrimental. It's not just industry conflicts of interest, so fee-for-service incentives and other incentives, they do influence how physicians behave. So we need to make sure that those incentives that don't align with patients' best interests are removed. But at the same time, we need deep professionalism. We can't just say, oh, yeah, we're going to do what's right if they're all removed. We need a little bit more than that to do our best. And I think people can see, like when there's more scrutiny, when we know somebody's looking at the quality of our sort of work, our performance, we tend to do better as well. So there are many things that affect physicians' behaviors. One of the things that we really want to eliminate are the ones that have a big effect, like conflicts of interest. And we do want to focus on what we're hopefully being taught at medical schools, is that patients come first, and end up in environments that are more patient-first environments and patient-centric environments.
Yeah, I want to come back to this issue of when other people are watching, because it strikes me the work around self-perception of professionalism hinges to some degree on what we mean by self-regulation. And it seems like there's a version of self-regulation which is about individuals regulating their own behavior themselves. When in a professional context, a profession being a group, not an individual, the self-regulation can also mean we are all looking over each other's shoulders all the time, right? So self-regulation is no longer an individual thing, it's a group activity. And I wondered, as I was reading some of the background papers that we were looking at, the extent to which what you mean by deep professionalism can also encompass the notion of a self-regulatory profession being one not where you rely on every individual to regulate themselves, but where you rely on the group to establish norms and standards and to enforce those norms and standards. Is that also a version of deep professionalism? What I heard, by the way, was humility.
Yes.
And is a key feature of deep professionalism. Is there also a feature of deep professionalism, which is, this isn't about me, it's about the larger group?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. So I do think that scrutiny makes a difference, right? Whether it's coming from within one's own profession or externally, it makes a difference, and we need to figure out the best practices for that to sort of improve care, and those that could have a detrimental effect on that scrutiny. But at the same time, why does it make this? If we're thinking about self-regulation, we're really thinking about what are the norms of this profession? What are the norms that are deeply embedded, and how are they displayed on a day-to-day basis? So what your peers are doing, and particularly what the leaders are doing, make a big difference. And so that is what changes cultural norms. So it does start with individuals as well displaying deep professionalism, but that can then encourage other people to do the same. Like, this is the appropriate thing to do. This is the accepted thing for me to do in this situation. And so we become socialized in that way when we're at medical school, and we continue to do so. Where things can go astray is that if the external measurements and policies also don't align. So we need both the internal work, and we need the structure around us to really do their best for our patients and enact those professional norms that we're often taught at a very early stage in our careers. So combining them both, I think, is the only way to do this.
So, I also want to go back and dig in a little bit to something you talked about in the slides around the self-concept of professionalism versus sort of the actual or deep professionalism, and how good are we at gauging ourselves as regards something like professionalism. And in the paper about this, the professionalism paradox paper, you talk about we are particularly poor at gauging our own performance when we're dealing with unfamiliar tasks, or tasks that are particularly complex, or where we're not getting good feedback. That those are places where we are maybe most at risk of misestimating how good we are at something. And I started to wonder about whether we are also at risk of misestimating ourselves when what we're being asked to look at is something with moral valence, like how good are you as a human being? How good are you, as a person, as a doctor? I thought in this context, if you were to ask 1,000 people, how much do you worry that you might hold racist feelings? The people who said, I don't worry about that at all, my guess is they actually are the ones I would worry about the most. And the ones who said, yeah, I worry, I probably do harbor some racist feelings. I try to check myself on that, right? That those are the ones I worry about least. And I wonder if the same dynamic is happening with professionalism, that this has a lot of moral valence. If you say, I worry a little about my professionalism, that is, in one way, that's, deep professionalism, it's humility, but it's also admitting to something that not a lot of people have the, maybe wherewithal to admit to because of that, because it's ethics.
Right. No, I agree with that. And this is what my research shows, that those that have a little bit more self-doubt about their ability to self-regulate, they recognize that accepting a conflict of interest and influence go hand in hand with each other. It's those when you reach a certain point and you get this inflated sense of professionalism that the problems arise. And I like the example that you gave, that is just showing that, I've run sort of this experiment quite a few times, and there is a cluster of people that will also say, sort of a separate cluster of people that will say, oh yeah, we'll be influenced, but I don't care, sort of what the hell effect. And so there's not much.
Those are called sociopaths.
There's not much we can do about that, but I think there is something that can be done for people that are misestimating what's happening in this particular thing. So the thing about physicians is that the specialized knowledge that we learn at medical school, we often think that we're experts, and people will say that we're experts, but when we think about expert intuition, it really happens under conditions that are quite regulated, right? It's the same type of condition. The context is not changing much. It's very familiar, and you get immediate feedback. So you can become an expert in recognizing these are the patterns and this is what I need to do. And then when it does go into an unfamiliar domain, or one where there is very little feedback and it changes quite a lot. So leadership decisions around the sort of morality, that's when we can basically fall if we rely on our own self-perceptions. And the moral domain is, it is a very interesting one, because it's one that people really hold precious about how they feel about themselves. And if you ask, if you look at the psychology research, where you ask people, do you think you're above average or below average on making ethical decisions or morality, everyone will say above
Everyone's
average.
above average.
Yes,
Yeah.
everyone's above
We're all
average.
better drivers too.
Yes, that's right. But when it comes to morality, it's even more skewed, because that is something that we hold very dear to ourselves, that we might even show that we're incompetent in certain areas, but showing that you're unethical is something that we really feel very averse to, which also plays in to the self-calibrating aspect of conflict of interest disclosure that I mentioned, that we're so averse to being seen as being unethical or unbiased. We do get motivated to say that we don't have any conflicts of interest, or to get an A rating on something that is seen as being potentially unethical. So that's another way that we can change norms now.
Let me, I really have more questions for you, but I'm going to ask a couple that are coming up in the chat. Eric Campbell wants to know, how likely do you think it is we'll ever get rid of gifts from drug companies? Would it be possible to eliminate that practice? Almost a political question, but maybe influenced by data such as the kinds of studies that you do. Do you have a political sense on that?
So it depends who's in charge of getting rid of this, right? So I think they've tried, and in one of the papers that I collaborated on, shows that there were some academic medical centers that did have bans for gifts from pharmaceutical industry. And we compared those to academic centers that didn't have the ban. And we found that it did make a difference, but not in every single academic center. That really shows that rules and policies are important, but so is something else, right? And that something else is the professional norms, the deep professionalism that I'm talking about. It could be possible to get rid of gifts from drug companies if there was a law in place. Is it possible to eliminate? There will always be some education, because there is some interaction that needs to take place. It's just how we manage that interaction between physicians and the pharmaceutical industry.
Very nice segue to Steve Joffe's question. He says, you've conveyed, at least to me, a view that implicit view all financial relationships between physicians or investigators and industry are to be avoided if possible. But do you think there are some relationships that may have enough net benefit to patients or the public that they would be worth that risk? And if so, what are your thoughts about managing those relationships?
Yeah. So I do think that there is some communication that needs to take place, and we have to think harder about how to manage it. That's where the big questions are coming in. Like, what are the structural reforms that could we do? If there's sponsored research, can we implement the separation and blinding aspect? If the communication, could it be done by experts that in a particular way that they can still remain independent but offer their views, and vice versa? So you can talk to each other, but not be directly accepting conflicts of interest, or even indirectly in a way that becomes known, so you feel indebted. So I think this is where we need to start thinking and testing some other management solutions for dealing with conflicts of interest.
Well, thank you so much. We're right at 1 o'clock. I have a dozen more questions, so I'm going to email them to you.
No problem, no problem.
And thank you to the audience for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here and being here on the holiday, Juneteenth. Really appreciate that. This was the only day that was going to work for all of our busy schedules. So we really appreciate your being willing to take some time on this day for this important topic. And thank you, Dr. Sah, for joining us. Look forward to further opportunities.
Thank you very much. Thank you.